She had 5 seconds to decide who to trust in a room full of enemies. Vanessa Sinclair had spent 10 years building an empire, surviving boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and enemies who smiled at her face while sharpening knives behind her back. She knew how power worked. She knew how danger felt. But nothing had prepared her for this. The applause was still echoing off the crystal chandeliers when she saw the first fake guard slide into position near the east exit. Then another. Then 3 more. The trap had already closed. She just hadn't felt the teeth yet. If this story already has you hooked, you're in the right place. Stay until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Whitmore Grand Hotel had seen its share of important evenings. Presidents had shaken hands in its marble lobby. Deals worth billions had been quietly sealed over its linen-covered tables. But on the 3rd Saturday of November, the ballroom on its 14th floor was dressed for something different, something that felt, at least on the surface, like genuine goodness happening in a world that didn't always make room for it. The Luminary Gala was in its 12th year. Black tie, 3-course dinner, a live auction that routinely pulled in 7 figures. The guest list read like a directory of the city's most influential people: tech founders, senators, hospital directors, a handful of old money families whose last names were carved into building facades across the skyline. The official purpose was fundraising for the Meridian Children's Hospital Foundation. But if you'd worked in rooms like this long enough, you understood the unofficial purpose just as well: to be seen, to be photographed, and to remind everyone else in attendance exactly where you stood in the hierarchy. Vanessa Sinclair stood at the top of it. At 30 years old, she was the youngest CEO in the history of Sinclair Capital, a position she'd inherited after her father's heart attack 3 years ago and immediately made her own. She'd grown the firm's assets by 60% in 36 months. She'd restructured 2 failing subsidiaries, cut the dead weight without sentiment, and closed deals in Singapore, Dubai, and Munich that her father's generation would have spent a decade pursuing. The financial press loved her, her competitors feared her, and the charity circuit adored her because she wrote checks that actually meant something. Tonight's check meant more than most. $22 million, she said into the microphone, and the room detonated. The standing ovation hit like a wave. Every person in that ballroom was on their feet, clapping, some of them visibly emotional, a few holding champagne flutes in the air, as if toasting the announcement itself. The foundation's director was openly crying at the edge of the stage. Camera flashes strobed across the room. Vanessa smiled, the practiced one, the composed one she'd spent years perfecting, and held the moment the way you hold a breath before diving. She was good at this. She knew that. The smile, the pause, the slight tilt of her chin that read as humble without being weak. She'd learned it the hard way, through early interviews where nerves showed too clearly, and presentations where she'd tried too hard to project confidence and ended up projecting desperation instead. She'd fixed all of it. Piece by piece, she'd built a version of herself that could walk into any room and own it before she said a single word. What she hadn't built, what no amount of preparation could give you, was armor against something you weren't expecting. She saw the first one while she was still at the podium. He was standing near the East Corridor entrance, one hand loosely at his side, the other resting on a radio clipped to his belt. Security, by all appearances. Dark suit, earpiece, the practiced stillness of someone trained to watch a room without being noticed. Vanessa had worked with security teams for long enough to recognize the posture. What she didn't recognize was the face. She'd spent 45 minutes that afternoon with Marcus Reed, her head of personal security, reviewing the team's placement for the evening. She'd met each one of the 8-person detail personally, a habit Marcus had drilled into her after a threatening letter 3 years ago. Know the people protecting you, he'd said, names and faces, always. The man at the East Corridor wasn't one of them. Vanessa kept her smile intact and let her eyes drift casually across the room the way anyone might after an announcement like that, taking in the applause, acknowledging faces in the crowd. She counted the exits without moving her head. Main entrance, North Corridor, East Corridor, Service Corridor, to the left of the kitchen. She found another unfamiliar face near the main entrance, then a third near the North Corridor. He was turned slightly away, but the body language was wrong. Not the relaxed professional stillness of her team, but the coiled tension of someone anticipating a cue. The applause was still going. She stepped back from the podium, accepted the foundation director's hand, a warm, tearful shake that she returned steadily, and descended the stage steps with her pulse running at twice its normal rate. Think, she told herself. Think before you move. She'd been in high-pressure situations before. Deals gone sideways, negotiations that turned hostile. One night in Jakarta, where a hotel fire had forced an evacuation, and she'd had to navigate a smoke-filled stairwell in heels while staying calm enough to keep two panicking junior executives from freezing up entirely. She knew what crisis felt like in her body, the narrowing of focus, the strange clarity that came after the initial shock of danger. It felt like this. She found Marcus at the edge of the room near the service hallway entrance. He was speaking quietly into his radio, and when he glanced up and saw her face, he moved to intercept her immediately. "Miss Sinclair, East Corridor," she said, keeping her voice low and her expression perfectly neutral. "Who is that?" Marcus looked toward the East Corridor entrance without hesitation, and something crossed his face, a flicker of recognition that died too quickly, replaced by the controlled blankness of someone fighting to stay professional. "I don't know," he said. 2 words. Quiet. And more frightening than anything she'd heard all evening. "There's another one at the main entrance," she said, "and one near the north side. I didn't recognize any of them from the briefing this afternoon." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Stay close to me. Don't—" His radio crackled. The voice on the other end said something she couldn't fully make out. A code, maybe, or a name. And the color left Marcus's face so fast it was almost visible. "What?" she said. He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years she saw something in Marcus Reed's eyes that she'd never seen before. Fear. "They replaced 2 of my people," he said. "Downstairs. I'm getting the call right now. Jenkins and Coyle were pulled from their posts about 20 minutes ago. Someone told them there was a change in the detail configuration, official-looking credentials. By the time anyone thought to verify, Marcus. The exits," he said. "I think the exits are—" A burst of static. His radio went dead. They both looked at it, then at each other. "Get me out of here," she said. "I'm working on it." He was already moving, hand on her arm, steering her toward the service corridor. "Stay right with me. Don't draw attention. Don't—" The service corridor door opened from the inside before they reached it. 2 men stepped out. Dark suits, earpieces, hands at their sides. They looked exactly like the security team was supposed to look, and they weren't part of her security team. Marcus stopped. "Mr. Reed," one of the men said pleasantly. "Miss Sinclair, there's been a slight change in the evening's arrangements." Oti. She didn't panic. That was the thing she'd think about afterward, in the weeks of quiet that followed. That in the worst moment of her life, she hadn't panicked. She'd gone cold. It was different. Panic was noise and motion and terrible decision-making. Cold was something else entirely. Cold was the brain stripping away everything unnecessary and running the numbers. The numbers, right now, were bad. Marcus was neutralized without a single word being exchanged. Both men simply positioned themselves on either side of him with the professional ease of people who had done this before, and the message was clear enough that he didn't move. There were at least 4 more unfamiliar faces in the ballroom that she'd identified, probably more she hadn't. Every exit appeared to be covered. The room held somewhere between 300 and 400 guests, still socializing, still drinking champagne, still unaware that the walls had grown teeth while they were watching her announcement. She was escorted back into the ballroom like a guest, not a prisoner. That was the elegance of it, she realized. No guns visible, no commands, just a subtle, terrible reorganization of the room that nobody else had noticed yet. They planned this for months, she thought. This isn't improvised. The thought was not comforting. She needed to think. She needed a way out, or at the very least, a way to reach someone who could help before whatever came next started happening. Her phone was in her clutch, but using it openly was out of the question. They'd be watching for exactly that. There were police officers positioned outside the hotel as event security, but she had no way to reach them without tipping off the people who were now controlling every corridor. She moved back into the crowd slowly, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server that she had no intention of drinking, letting herself be absorbed back into the social flow of the room. The two men from the service corridor settled into positions nearby, close enough to react if she ran, far enough to look like normal security if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. She scanned the room, not frantically. That would register on the faces around her, and attention was the last thing she wanted. She moved her eyes the way you move a searchlight, systematically, without hurrying. Most of the guests were exactly what they appeared to be: influential, comfortable, unsuspecting. She could see the body language of people who had no idea that anything was wrong, and that body language was achingly normal. A senator she recognized was laughing at something his wife had said. Two venture capitalists were comparing watches near the bar. A table of hospital administrators were still discussing the donation announcement, heads bent together with the pleased, slightly disbelieving expressions of people who'd just watched a very large check land in their budget. None of them could help her, not without causing exactly the kind of visible commotion that would accelerate whatever timeline her captors were working on. She needed someone who could see what she was seeing, someone whose eyes were already reading the room differently than everyone else's. She found him almost by accident. He was sitting at a table near the center of the room. Not a prominent position, not a corner either, just a middle table that gave a clean sightline to every corner of the ballroom. He was alone. His table had been assigned 4 guests, and the other 3 seats were empty, their occupants presumably absorbed into the networking current flowing around the room. He hadn't followed them. He was sitting with a glass of water, not champagne, water, and his hands were loose on the table, and his eyes were doing something that stopped her cold. They were moving the way hers were moving, not the unfocused drift of someone daydreaming, not the polite eye contact management of someone trying not to appear awkward at a gala they'd attended alone. He was reading the room, systematically. She could see it at the pattern, the way his gaze paused at exits, the way it tracked the unfamiliar security personnel without lingering long enough to signal awareness, the way it returned to the same reference points in a rotation that was too deliberate to be accidental. He looked ordinary. That was the first thing she'd have said to describe him if someone had asked. Just a man, medium height, late 30s, the kind of face you'd see in a faculty meeting or a parent-teacher conference and forget within minutes. Brown hair going slightly gray at the temples. A rented tuxedo that fit well enough but not perfectly. No jewelry except a simple watch. He looked like someone who'd been invited because someone else thought it would be good for him to get out of the house. But his eyes were running threat assessments. She'd spent enough time around her father's security consultants, enough time in briefings with Marcus's team to recognize that specific quality of attention. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't anxiety. It was training. The particular way that certain kinds of training rewired how you processed a room, permanently and involuntarily, so that you couldn't stop seeing angles and threats and sightlines even when you were sitting at a charity dinner trying to drink a glass of water. She made a decision. She moved. The social geography of the room gave her a path. A natural-looking route from where she stood to the bar that passed within a few feet of his table. She took it unhurriedly, pausing once to exchange a brief pleasantry with a woman she half recognized from a board meeting 18 months ago, smiling, nodding, moving on. She passed his table. She didn't stop, didn't look at him directly, just shifted her trajectory slightly, close enough, and kept her voice at a register that wouldn't carry past 3 feet. "Help me." 2 words. She moved on without breaking stride. He didn't react. That was the first thing she noticed from her peripheral vision. No jolt, no sharp look in her direction, no visible response at all. He just brought his water glass to his lips and set it down again, and his eyes continued their quiet rotation around the room. For a terrible moment, she thought she'd miscalculated, that he was exactly what he looked like, just a man with restless eyes and a habit of sitting alone, and she had just whispered the most dangerous 2 words of her evening to a middle school history teacher from a suburb somewhere who was going to turn and ask her to repeat herself. Then she noticed his left hand. It had moved, not dramatically, just a small repositioning on the table, fingers spread briefly and then relaxed again. But the pattern of movement was precise, deliberate. She'd seen that gesture before, in a very different context, in a briefing room where an ex-Delta consultant had been explaining close-quarters assessment methodology. It was a grounding technique, the kind of thing you did to reset your focus before acting. He'd heard her. He was thinking. She returned to the social flow of the room and let herself be guided slightly closer to the east wall by the gentle pressure of the crowd, her champagne glass still untouched. One of the false security officers tracked her movement. She could feel it, that specific weight of surveillance, and she adjusted accordingly, stopping to speak to an elderly man who turned out to be a retired federal judge and who wanted to tell her at considerable length how remarkable the donation announcement had been. She listened. She smiled. She watched the quiet man at the center table over the judge's shoulder, and she waited. He looked at her once, just once, brief and direct, making sure she was looking back. Then his eyes moved deliberately. North corridor, east corridor, service door, stage. A circuit. She followed it. He was mapping the threat positions. So was she. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the cold and the focus and the careful, controlled management of her own terror, something else surfaced. Something unexpected. Not comfort, exactly. The situation was too genuinely dangerous for comfort, but something adjacent to it. He sees it. He sees exactly what I see. I'm not alone in this room. She exhaled slowly through her nose. 2 beats. 3. The retired federal judge was still talking. Truly extraordinary, Ms. Sinclair. Your father would have been very proud. Thank you, she said. He would have loved tonight. And above his shoulder, the quiet man at the center table turned his water glass slowly in his hands. A small, deliberate gesture. And she understood it as clearly as if he'd spoken. I'm with you. Stay calm. Wait for my signal. The chandeliers blazed overhead. The jazz quartet played something smooth and untroubled. 340 people ate and drank and laughed in a room that had already become something else entirely. Vanessa Sinclair smiled at the retired federal judge and counted exits and waited. His name was Ethan Walker, and he was thinking about his daughter's science project. That was the honest truth of it. Somewhere between the foundation director's opening remarks and Vanessa Sinclair's announcement, he drifted. The way he always drifted at events like this, into the quiet corner of his own head where practical problems lived. Lily had a diorama due Monday, 3rd grade ecosystems unit, and she'd chosen the deep ocean, which meant they needed to figure out how to make an anglerfish out of clay before Sunday night without it looking like a potato with teeth. He'd been mentally running through the craft supply situation at home. They had black paint. He was pretty sure they had wire. The googly eyes were a question mark. When the woman in the emerald dress walked past his table, 2 words, barely a whisper. Help me. He'd set his water glass down without hurrying and turned those words over in his head the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. His first thought, the reasonable, civilian thought, was that he'd misheard. The room was loud. Music, conversation, the specific high-frequency buzz of wealthy people enjoying their own generosity. Misheard was the logical explanation. His second thought came from somewhere older and quieter, and it wasn't about logic. It was about the way she'd moved, the precise, unhurried stride of someone working very hard to appear unhurried. The half-second she'd spent near the retiring federal judge, not really listening to him, eyes doing something else. And before that, at the podium, during the applause, a micro-expression that flickered and vanished so fast most people would have blinked through it. Fear, controlled, the expensive kind, the kind that cost years to learn. Ethan had spent those same years learning to recognize it. He pressed his left hand flat against the tablecloth. Reset. The old reflex, the one that quieted the noise and brought everything into focus. He'd done it 1,000 times in conditions considerably worse than a hotel ballroom, crouched in doorways in places where the air smelled like diesel and burning plastic, and the wrong footstep meant everything went sideways. He hadn't expected to need it tonight. He hadn't expected tonight to be anything other than a long, slightly uncomfortable evening in a rented tuxedo, nodding politely at people he didn't know, eating food he didn't particularly want, and getting home by 11 to relieve the babysitter and check on Lily. He started mapping the room. He did it the same way he'd been trained to do it, methodically, without the kind of sustained focus that reads as suspicious on a human face. Short looks, consistent intervals, building a picture in pieces. What he assembled over the next 2 minutes made his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the food. 6 men positioned at or near every viable exit. None of them were running standard event security body language. Too tense, too deliberate, communicating via microsignals he recognized from operational environments. The kind of coordination that didn't come from a security company's weekend training seminar. It came from people who'd done this before, in teams, under pressure, real pressure. The exits themselves appeared functionally sealed, not locked probably, but controlled. Anyone trying to leave would be redirected. Anyone making noise about it would be handled. The operation was clean, well-resourced, planned in advance, probably weeks in advance, by someone who understood the geometry of this particular room and had taken time to study it, which meant the woman in the emerald dress was the target, and 340 other people were collateral. Ethan exhaled once, slow and steady, and looked at her over the judge's shoulder until she looked back. He gave her the circuit, exits, positions, stage, so she'd know he'd seen the same things she'd seen. Then he turned his water glass in his hands, a quiet signal, and watched her receive it without changing her expression. She understood. That was the thing that cut through everything else, the thing that lodged itself in his chest in a way that sharpened his focus rather than muddying it. She was afraid, genuinely, legitimately afraid, in a situation that warranted it, and she was handling it, not pretending it wasn't happening, not falling apart, handling it with whatever tools she had available and reaching out for help with the specific controlled precision of someone who knew exactly what she was asking for. He didn't know her beyond what everyone in the room knew her. Vanessa Sinclair, Sinclair Capital, the announcement that had made the room erupt. But he knew that move. The whisper, the stillness, the deliberate reach toward the one person in the room whose eyes were doing the wrong thing. He'd made that reach himself, in different rooms, under different skies. It took a specific kind of nerve. He respected it. He also understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose professional instincts had never entirely gone dormant, that respecting her nerve didn't solve the problem. Solving the problem required something he hadn't done in 4 years. Ethan Walker reached into himself for the version of himself he'd been trying to put away. It was still there. Of course it was. You didn't do what he'd done for 11 years and walk it back by moving to the suburbs and grading quizzes about the Byzantine Empire. The skills didn't leave. The wiring didn't change. What changed was the context and the choice. Every single day, the choice to be a person who drove a 10-year-old sedan and packed lunches and sat in bleachers for school soccer games rather than a person who operated in the dark, in places most people couldn't find on a map. He'd made that choice because Lily needed a father, and because Sarah's death had redrawn every line he'd ever used to navigate his life, and because some part of him, the honest part, had needed to step back from the edge before the edge became the only thing he knew how to stand on. But Lily wasn't in this room. 340 innocent people were, and whatever was coming had already started. He started thinking through the problem with the systematic detachment he'd been trained to apply to exactly these conditions. Assets, himself, knowledge of the room layout, the element of surprise as long as the operatives didn't identify him as a threat, and potentially Vanessa Sinclair herself if she could communicate without detection. Liabilities, no weapon, no backup, no communications, no knowledge of the full scope of the operation or how many personnel were involved. Unknown factors, what precisely they wanted, whether they'd use violence against the crowd, and what their timeline looked like. He needed more information. He needed to move without being seen moving, and he needed to not get shot. Straightforward enough. He stood up from his table with the casual ease of someone heading to the bar, straightening his jacket with one hand, and began to drift. The social geometry of a room like this was actually useful for what he needed. There were enough people, enough movement, enough of the ordinary ebb and flow of a crowded party that a man walking slowly with a glass of water in his hand read as exactly that and nothing more. He took a route that brought him near the North Corridor entrance without approaching it directly. A pause to look at an ice sculpture, a slight drift to the left while appearing to scan the room for someone he was looking for. Close enough. The man positioned near the North Corridor was 32, maybe 33. Military posture, definitely. Civilian haircut, recent, the kind that came from trying to soften a military look rather than from actually growing it out. His right hand rested near his jacket lapel. Not on a weapon, not visibly, but the placement was practiced. He was communicating with at least one other operative. Ethan caught the subvocal murmur of a throat mic transmission when he passed close enough. Throat mics. Coordinated communications. This was not a small operation. He drifted back toward the center of the room and passed within speaking distance of Vanessa on his way. He didn't look at her. He didn't slow down. But he angled close enough to the edge of the conversation she was managing. A small cluster of guests had gathered, drawn by the gravity of the evening's announcement, and spoke at the same volume she'd used with him. North Corridor, throat mic. At least 6 that I've found. Don't run. He was past her before the last word landed. He found an empty chair at a table near the stage and sat down, angling himself so he could see the full sweep of the ballroom. His heart rate was elevated. Not through the roof, not yet, but running higher than a dinner party warranted. He noticed it the way you notice an engine running hotter than normal. Information, not panic. The thing about this kind of work that nobody ever explained properly, he'd always thought, was that fear wasn't the enemy. Fear was data. Fear told you the situation was real, and the stakes were real, and your body was preparing accordingly. What mattered was what you did with it, whether you let it drive or whether you kept it in the passenger seat and drove yourself. He kept it in the passenger seat. He was thinking through approach options. There were maybe 3 viable ones, each with significant problems, when a hand landed on his shoulder and he almost came out of his chair. Ethan Walker. He turned. The man standing behind him was 60-something, silver-haired, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors in difficult conditions. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit too well to be rented, and his eyes were doing the same thing Ethan's eyes were doing. "You're with the Foundation Board," Ethan said, remembering from the program. "Hargrove. Robert Hargrove." He sat down in the adjacent chair without being invited and leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. His voice was barely above a murmur. "I'm going to assume, based on what your face has been doing for the last 10 minutes, that you've noticed the same things I've noticed." Ethan looked at him steadily. "What did you do before the Foundation Board?" 22 years, Defense Intelligence Agency. Hargrove's eyes moved to the North Corridor and back. "Before that, things we don't discuss at dinner parties." "You?" "SEAL teams, 11 years. Hargrove nodded once, a small professional acknowledgement. "Then you've counted 6. 6 that I'm sure of. Could be more in the service areas." "There are 2 more in the kitchen corridor. I walked past on my way back from the bathroom 5 minutes ago. 2 men who had no business being in a kitchen corridor." He paused. "I've also lost visual on 3 members of Miss Sinclair's protection detail in the last 20 minutes. Her head of security looks like he's been effectively neutralized near the east wall." Ethan processed this. 8 confirmed hostile at minimum. Coordinated communications, all exits covered. The timeline, whatever it was, hadn't started yet, which meant they were still in the window before things went loud. "What do you make of the objective?" Hargrove asked. "Her." Ethan nodded fractionally toward Vanessa. "She approached me about 12 minutes ago. She'd already made the people." Hargrove's expression shifted slightly. "She made them?" "Yeah." A brief silence while Hargrove recalibrated whatever he'd assumed about the woman in the emerald dress. "Extraction operation," he said finally. "They want her alive. That's the only read that fits the setup. If this were anything else, it would have already happened." Agreed. Which meant they had a specific method in mind, a specific route out, a specific moment they were waiting for. "When does the event officially end?" Hargrove checked his watch. "Program wraps in about 40 minutes. That's when the guest flow toward the exits would start naturally. My guess is they used that movement to cover the extraction." 40 minutes. That wasn't much time, and it was also more than enough time for something to go badly wrong in ways neither of them could anticipate. 2 men with no weapons against at least 8 with coordinated communications and a plan they'd rehearsed. The math was not good. "We need to get word to the police outside," Ethan said. "I've been thinking about that. My phone—" Hargrove stopped, reached into his jacket pocket, and retrieved a device that looked like a phone but clearly wasn't functioning as one. The screen was dark despite the fact that he was pressing the power button. "Jammed." Ethan tried his own. Same result. He put it back in his pocket. "They're running a signal block." "Which they would have set up before anyone arrived. Professional." Hargrove said the word without admiration. "Just assessment." They've done everything right. Almost everything. Ethan looked at the room. At the 400 people in it, the crystal and the candlelight and the jazz quartet still playing something easy and warm, the whole gorgeous construction of a normal evening that these people were still inhabiting while the room had already become something else. They didn't account for two of us. Hargrove looked at him for a moment. Then something crossed his face, not quite a smile, more the expression of someone who has just had a calculation confirm what they suspected. "What are you thinking?" Ethan told him. It wasn't a good plan. He knew that. There was no version of the next 40 minutes that qualified as a good plan, because good plans required resources and preparation and backup and information, none of which they had an adequate supply. What they had was improvisation and instinct, and the specific hard-won knowledge of how operations like this were structured, the assumptions built into them, the moments of vulnerability that even a well-run operation couldn't entirely eliminate. You could plan for most things. You couldn't plan for the presence of two people inside your perimeter who knew what you were doing and were willing to do something about it. That was the gap, small and imperfect, and likely to get at least one of them hurt, but a gap. Hargrove listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ethan finished, there was a pause. "The timing on the third piece," Hargrove said. "That's the piece that doesn't work." "I know. If the signal block is hardware-based and it's somewhere in the building, we need to find it and disable it before we do anything else. Otherwise, even if we create the disruption, there's no way for the police outside to know." "I know," Ethan said again. "That's the part I'm working on." Another pause. The jazz quartet transitioned into something slower. "There's a woman at table 7, Hargrove said. "Retired federal magistrate. I've known her for 20 years. If we can get her moving toward the east side of the room without making it visible, she can—" He stopped himself, reconsidered. "No, too many variables." "The signal block is probably in the service area," Ethan said, "or the hotel's communications room. There's one on this floor. I saw it when I came in. It would have been the logical place to install it." Hargrove nodded slowly. "The communications room is off the north corridor, which is where your man with the throat mic is stationed." "Yes." "So to get to the communications room, you'd need to get past him." "Yes." "Without anyone noticing that a guest had wandered into a service area." "Right." Hargrove looked at him. "You're going to need a reason to be back there." "Working on it." The older man was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced what appeared to be a hotel key card. He turned it over once in his fingers and slid it across the table to Ethan. "Staff access. My foundation contact, the event coordinator. She gave me one this afternoon in case I needed to access the prep areas during the event. I never used it." Ethan looked at the card. "How confident are you that it works on interior service doors?" "Confident enough." It wasn't certainty, but it was something, which was more than he'd had 60 seconds ago. Ethan pocketed the card. "I need 10 minutes, he said. "Keep eyes on Sinclair. If anything starts moving before I'm back, create noise, knock something over, cause a commotion, anything to delay their timeline. Panic in the crowd is a problem for them as much as it is for us. And if you don't come back in 10 minutes? Ethan considered that honestly. "Then you're down to 1. Hargrove held his gaze for a moment. There was something in the older man's eyes that Ethan recognized. The specific quality of someone who had been in bad situations before and understood exactly how bad a situation could get, and who had made peace with that understanding a long time ago. Not recklessness, not bravado, just clarity. "Go," Hargrove said. Ethan stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the north corridor. He thought about Lily once, not in a way that paralyzed him, just a flash of her face, the gap in her front teeth from the tooth she'd lost in September, the way she fell asleep reading with her book still open on her chest. That image did for him what the hand press on the tablecloth had done. It grounded him, reminded him what the weight of this was, and why it mattered that he did this right rather than just fast. He thought about Sarah too, briefly, and without letting himself stay there. He thought about the way she used to say, only half joking, that she'd married a man whose definition of a quiet evening was entirely different from hers. She hadn't been wrong. She'd loved him anyway, all the complicated, difficult parts of him, and when she died, he'd tried very hard to leave those parts of himself behind, because without her there to balance them, They felt like they might swallow him. Standing at the edge of the North Corridor, alone, in a rented tuxedo, with a stolen key card and no weapon, and 8 armed men somewhere in the building, he understood something he hadn't let himself think in 4 years. He hadn't left those parts behind. He'd just been waiting for a room that needed them. The North Corridor stretched ahead of him, dim and quiet, the sounds of the party receding. Somewhere down its length, a man with a throat mic was watching for exactly what Ethan was doing. Ethan kept walking. His footsteps were quiet on the carpet. His breathing was steady. His mind was entirely, completely calm in the way that a mind can only be calm when everything non-essential has been stripped away and only the work remains. He didn't think about what came after. After was a luxury. After was the space on the other side of a door you hadn't opened yet. He thought about angles and timing and the specific location of the hotel communications room and the weight of a keycard in his jacket pocket and the man somewhere in the dark ahead of him who didn't know he was coming. He thought about 340 people in a candlelit room who still believed this was just a party. And he walked forward into the dark. The North Corridor was 73 feet long. Ethan had measured it with his eyes when he'd first arrived at the hotel. Not because he'd expected to need that information. Not because he'd walked in tonight anticipating anything other than bad salmon and small talk, but because measuring spaces was something his brain did automatically now, the way other people noticed paint colors or ambient temperature. 73 feet of carpeted corridor, 3 service doors on the left side, 1 on the right, a 90-degree turn at the end that led to the hotel's administrative wing. The communications room was the second door on the left, 40 feet in. He'd seen the placard on his way to the ballroom and filed it away without thinking about why. The man with the throat mic was stationed at the corridor entrance, positioned to look like he was monitoring the hallway as part of normal event security, which was exactly what he was doing, except that normal event security didn't run coordinated signal jamming operations and wasn't planning to kidnap the evening's keynote speaker. Ethan came around the corner from the ballroom side with a slightly irritated expression and his phone in his hand, squinting at the dark screen the way a man squints at technology that is failing him in a specific personal way. "Excuse me," he said, not slowing down. "My phone's gone completely dead. Is there somewhere I can find a charging cable? The event coordinator mentioned there was a supply room back here." The operative turned. He was younger up close, late 20s maybe, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been clenched for several years straight. His eyes did a fast assessment of Ethan that Ethan recognized and didn't react to. "Sir, this area is restricted during the event." "Right, yeah, I know. Sorry." Ethan kept moving, not aggressively, just with the distracted momentum of someone who wasn't entirely tracking what he was being told. "I'm on the foundation board. I was told we had access to the prep areas. Robert Hargrove arranged it, if you need to check with someone." He produced the keycard and held it up without stopping. 1 beat, 2. The operative stepped sideways to block him. That was the tell. A real security guard redirecting a lost guest would have used words, "Sir, please, let me find someone to help you." The body block was a combat reflex, the kind that fired before conscious thought could moderate it. It told Ethan that the man's training was real and recent, and that he'd just registered Ethan as something other than a confused party guest. The window was maybe half a second. Ethan closed the distance and put him down. It wasn't clean. It was never clean in a carpeted corridor with formal wear and no preparation. Ethan's first grab missed slightly, and the operative got a hand up fast enough to create a brief, ugly scramble against the wall that Ethan resolved by driving a knee into the man's solar plexus and then controlling the fall to keep the impact quiet. The whole thing took 4 seconds and produced a sound like someone dropping a heavy bag of laundry. Not nothing, but not the kind of noise that carried to a ballroom 40 feet away over jazz music and conversation. Ethan caught the earpiece as it fell, checked the corridor in both directions, empty, and pulled the man into the first service door on the left, which was unlocked and turned out to be a linen storage room. He propped him against the shelving in a position that would maintain his airway and looked at the earpiece in his hand. Voices. Quiet, clipped, professional. He couldn't make out the words without putting it in his ear, which would tell them immediately that something was wrong. The voice pattern would be off. He held it close enough to catch fragments. "Position 4, confirm." A response he couldn't hear. Then, 7 minutes, Sinclair position? 7 minutes. He put the earpiece in his breast pocket, used the keycard on the second door on the left, and stepped into the hotel communications room. It was exactly what he'd expected. A small room, functional, smelling of electronics and recycled air, rack-mounted equipment along one wall, and a desk with 2 monitors along the other. And sitting in the corner, zip-tied to a chair with a piece of gaffer tape over his mouth, was a hotel employee whose ID badge read, Communications Tech, D. Parrish. Parrish's eyes went wide when Ethan came through the door. Then they went wider when Ethan held a finger to his lips. The jamming equipment was on the lower rack, a device he recognized from its profile as a commercial-grade cellular and radio frequency suppressor, the kind that required active power and a direct connection to the building's electrical system. Not sophisticated by military standards, but effective and portable, and exactly what you'd need if you wanted to quietly neutralize everyone's ability to call for help in a contained space. Ethan crouched in front of it and found the power coupling. He looked at it for a moment because the correct move here was not what his hands wanted to do. His hands wanted to rip it out of the rack, which would work but would also trigger an immediate alert on whatever monitoring the operatives had in place. He needed something that would read as a malfunction rather than a deliberate interruption. He found a data cable running between 2 components and bent it, not breaking it, just creating enough of a stress point that the connection became intermittent. The device's status light flickered. Then he reached behind the secondary power supply and shifted the cooling fan's position by 2 degrees, which was enough to begin a thermal buildup that would register as equipment failure within 4 to 6 minutes. 4 to 6 minutes of degraded signal before full restoration of cellular communications. Not a lot of time, but enough. If everything else went right, which it probably wouldn't, because it never entirely did. He pulled the gaffer tape from Parrish's mouth, slowly, because the man flinched, and cut the zip ties with a small utility blade from the desk. "Don't speak," Ethan said quietly. "There are armed men in the hotel. Is there an emergency line in this room, hardwired, not cellular?" Parrish blinked. He was about 35, soft-handed, clearly not someone who'd spent any part of his professional life preparing for this. He was holding himself together through what looked like sheer determination, and Ethan respected it. Yes. The building emergency line. It bypasses the main switchboard." He pointed to a red handset mounted on the wall. "Does it connect to the police dispatch or the hotel's security desk?" "Hotel security downstairs, but they have a direct line to the city's emergency services. Pick it up. Tell them there are armed men on the 14th floor, that the exits are controlled, that there are approximately 340 hostages in the main ballroom, and that the situation is likely to go active within 7 minutes. Can you do that?" Parrish looked at the phone, looked at Ethan. Something in his face did the particular thing that faces do when someone has made a decision they didn't know they'd already made. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that. Don't open that door for anyone until the police are inside the building." He picked up the key card from the desk and was back in the corridor in 30 seconds. The earpiece in his breast pocket was producing a higher volume of chatter now. He couldn't make out the words, but the frequency told him enough. Something had shifted in the timeline, or the absence of the operative from his post had been noted, or both. He moved back toward the ballroom at a pace that was faster than walking and slower than running. And as he came around the corner into the main space, he found Hargrove exactly where he'd left him, standing near the table with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving steadily around the room. Hargrove looked at him once, read something in his face. 5 minutes? Ethan said. 3, Hargrove said. They moved the timeline. Something triggered. Ethan looked at the room. 3 minutes, which meant the thing he'd been hoping to avoid, the loud version of this, the one that endangered the people sitting at these tables, was now essentially unavoidable. He found Vanessa across the room. She was still managing conversation, still composed, but the composure was thinner now. He could see it at the edges, the way a structure shows stress before it fails. She'd been alone in this for 30 minutes without any assurance that help was coming. That was a long time to hold a smile in place while your body ran on terror and adrenaline. Their eyes met across the room. He held up 3 fingers. He watched her understand it, watched her file it away. And then he watched her do something that he hadn't expected. She started moving, not toward him, not toward an exit, She moved toward the center of the room, working her way through the guest clusters with the fluid ease of a skilled socializer, touching an arm here, offering a word there, but placing herself with quiet precision near the tables that held the largest concentrations of guests. She was positioning herself as an anchor, Ethan realized, making herself visible to as many people as possible, so that when things went loud, there would be a face in the chaos that people recognized and could orient toward. It was exactly the right instinct, and it wasn't something he'd told her to do. He didn't have time to think about that. "The east side," he said to Hargrove, "the operative near the east corridor. He's the one controlling that exit. If they move to take her, that's the route. Can you—" "I can slow him down," Hargrove said. "I'm not 28 years old, but I can slow him down. That's all I need." "And you?" "The two at the main entrance, and whatever comes after." Hargrove looked at him with the steady expression of someone who had assessed a situation and accepted its parameters. "Don't get shot," he said. "Working on it." The lights went out. Not a gradual dimming, a total, immediate cut, the kind that didn't come from a circuit breaker, but from something deliberate at the source. For 3 full seconds, the ballroom was in pure, complete darkness, and the sound that rose from 340 people was a collective intake of breath that was almost worse than screaming. The sound of a room full of people all realizing simultaneously that something was very wrong. Then the emergency lights kicked in, low and orange and casting everything in the flat, shadowless light of a space that had suddenly stopped being a party. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice came from the main entrance, amplified, controlled, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this specific sentence. "Nobody needs to be hurt tonight. We need everyone to remain exactly where they are." A scream. Short, cut off. Then another voice from the north side. "Hands visible. Everyone, hands on the tables." The panic hit the room like a physical thing. People were on their feet, chairs scraping back, hands going to phones that weren't working, voices rising in overlapping waves of confusion and fear. Near the bar, someone knocked over a table, and the crash of glasses hitting marble was loud enough that half the room flinched in unison. Ethan was already moving. He'd fixed the positions of the 2 men at the main entrance during the 3 seconds of darkness. The muscle memory of spending years operating in conditions where light was a luxury had given him a spatial map he could act on without seeing. He moved through the panicking crowd the way water moves through a space, not fighting the current but using it, and when he came out on the other side of a cluster of fleeing guests, he was 3 feet from the operative on the left side of the main entrance. The man was facing the crowd, hand on a visible sidearm he hadn't drawn yet because drawing it would accelerate the panic and they needed controlled chaos, not the kind that turned into a stampede. That calculation, smart, professional, correct, was also the thing that cost him. He was managing the room when Ethan came in from the angle he hadn't been watching. It was fast and it was ugly, and Ethan took a forearm across the side of his head that made his vision white out for a full second, long enough for the room to lurch sideways and his knee to hit the floor. He got back up. That was the whole job sometimes. You got hit and you got back up and you kept going because the alternative was worse. The second man at the entrance was turning toward him when Ethan put the first one down, and there was a moment, maybe a full second, maybe less, where both of them understood exactly what was happening and neither of them had completed the motion they were in the middle of. The operative reached for his sidearm. Ethan was closer. He didn't get the gun. What he got was control of the arm that was reaching for it, and what followed was the specific, terrible negotiation of 2 people in close quarters, both trying to determine the outcome of the same moment, and it hurt, and it was loud. And somewhere in the middle of it, Ethan heard the operative's radio crackle, and a voice say something sharp in what sounded like a question. He got the operative off his feet and into the wall, and the gun hit the floor and slid under a table, and Ethan left it there because picking it up would cost him 2 seconds he didn't have and would change the optics of the room in ways that might make people run toward the exits that were still controlled. He stood up. His left ear was ringing. His rib said something he declined to process. Across the room, near the east corridor, he could see Hargrove, 60-something, silver-haired, in a well-fitting tuxedo, engaged in what appeared to be a heated physical argument with the operative stationed there. Hargrove was not winning. He also wasn't losing, which meant he was doing exactly what he'd said he'd do, slowing him down. The man who'd spoken through the amplifier, the one running this operation, based on the positioning and the cadence of command, was near the center of the room now, and Ethan could see the shift in his body language as he processed the collapse of his eastern and western perimeter positions. The thing about a well-planned operation was that it was planned. When the plan changed, the people running it had to recalibrate. And recalibration took time, and time was the only currency Ethan was working with. "Everyone get down!" Ethan's voice carried across the room. Not a shout, not quite, but the particular volume and register of a command, the kind that cut through noise because it was shaped differently than noise. "Get away from the exits, move toward the center, get down on the floor." Some people did. Others froze. A few ran for exits anyway, because panic has its own logic, and when people ran for the controlled exits, the operatives there had to make a choice between maintaining their posts and physically stopping fleeing guests, and that choice cost them their positions. Sinclair. One of the remaining operatives had Vanessa by the arm, not roughly, not yet, but with the controlled grip of someone prepared to be rough if she made it necessary. He was pulling her toward the service corridor. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "Let go of me," she said. Her voice was flat and cold, and entirely steady. "Miss Sinclair?" "I said let go." She wasn't complying, and she wasn't panicking, and the operative didn't quite know what to do with that, which was the half-second Ethan needed to cross the distance between them. He grabbed the operative's wrist, the one gripping Vanessa, and applied the specific mechanical pressure that forced the grip to open, regardless of intent. The man's hand came off her arm, and then his attention came to Ethan, and what followed was loud enough that the guests nearest to them scrambled backward, and the circle around them widened rapidly. Ethan took 2 hits. The first he rolled with enough to reduce the damage. The second landed clean and dropped him to one knee on the ballroom floor, and the room tilted for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. He heard someone nearby, a woman's voice, shout something he couldn't parse through the ringing. He got up. He was getting tired of getting up, but he got up. The operative was better than the others, faster, more technical, the kind of training that went beyond standard security work into something that had been practiced daily for a long time. They went through a minute and a half that felt considerably longer, and Ethan won it the same way he'd won situations like this before. Not by being stronger or faster, but by being willing to absorb more than the other person expected and keep going until an opening appeared. He was on his feet when the first siren reached the room, faint, through the walls still distant. But a siren, and then another, and then the unmistakable frequency of multiple emergency vehicles converging, and the sound of it moved through the ballroom like a different kind of wave. Not panic this time, but something that broke in the opposite direction. Hope was louder than fear, sometimes, if only just. The operative he was facing heard it too. He saw the calculation happen in real time, the reassessment, the rapid processing of a situation that had just fundamentally changed. The man took 2 steps backward toward the service corridor. "Don't," Ethan said. His voice was rough. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. "It's over. There's nowhere to go." The man looked at him. Something moved across his face that Ethan couldn't entirely read. Not defeat, not quite, but the specific look of a professional who has just watched a plan collapse and is doing the math on what comes next. He ran. Ethan let him go. Chasing him through the hotel was not the priority. The priority was in this room, with these people. And as he turned back to the ballroom, the full weight of what the last 8 minutes had actually looked like settled on him all at once. The room was a wreck. Tables overturned, glasses broken across the marble, a catering station on its side near the north wall. The emergency lighting cast everything in that flat amber glow that made people's faces look hollowed out and strange. Guests were on the floor, under tables, pressed against walls. Some were crying. Some were on their phones now. The jamming was down, or almost down, because he could hear the distinctive sound of multiple people connecting to emergency lines simultaneously. A man near the bar had a cut on his forehead from fallen glass and was pressing a cloth napkin against it with the dazed expression of someone still catching up to what had just happened. Hargrove was across the room, leaning against a pillar with his jacket torn and his lip bleeding and the expression of a man who has just done something his body was going to spend the next week reminding him about. He met Ethan's eyes and nodded. Ethan nodded back. He found Vanessa 6 feet away from where she'd been standing. She hadn't run to a wall or a table. She was standing in the open space of the ballroom with her arms around a young woman who was shaking badly. A guest, maybe 25, who had clearly hit the outer edge of what she could handle. Vanessa was speaking quietly, steadily, her chin down close to the woman's ear, one hand on her back. She looked up and found Ethan. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been in a fight, in a formal shirt that no longer qualified as formal, with a cut above his left ear he hadn't noticed yet, and the kind of expression that comes with a body running on the last of its reserves. He probably looked terrible. He didn't think about it. "Are you hurt?" he said. She shook her head, looked at him more carefully. "You are." "I'm fine." She looked at him in a way that suggested she had thoughts about that assessment, but was choosing to file them for later. The young woman she'd been holding had steadied enough to pull back slightly, and Vanessa kept one hand on her arm while she looked around the room, taking inventory the same way Ethan was, moving her eyes across the faces and the damage with the particular focus of someone accounting for everything. "The exits," she said, "the ones I couldn't get to. The police should have them from the outside by now." Even as he said it, he could hear the change in the sounds coming through the walls. Voices on the other side of doors, the specific frequency of organized response rather than emergency response. Law enforcement in a building sounds different from law enforcement arriving at one. She exhaled. It was small and controlled, and it was probably the first full breath she'd allowed herself in the last 30 minutes. "The communications room," he said. "There was a hotel employee, Parrish, his name was. He got word out." "I want to find him," she said. Later. I want to make sure he will be." The main entrance doors opened from the outside. 3 police officers came through in the specific, careful way that trained people enter a space they don't yet fully understand, and behind them 2 more, and then voices calling for calm and asking people to stay where they were. Ethan sat down on the floor. It was not a graceful movement. It was a man whose legs had finished delivering what had been asked of them and were now submitting a complaint about it. He sat on the ballroom floor among the broken glass and the overturned chairs and the wreckage of the most expensive party he'd ever attended, and he put his hands on his knees and breathed. His ear was ringing. His ribs were filing a formal grievance. The cut above his eye was making itself known. From across the room, a police officer was already heading toward him, hand up, speaking. He couldn't quite track the words yet. His hearing was still sorting itself out. Near the entrance, more officers were moving through the space in pairs. Someone was on a radio calling numbers in. Room secured, casualties, requesting medical. Ethan thought about Lily. He thought about Monday morning, the science project, the anglerfish that still needed to happen, the googly eyes that may or may not be in the craft drawer. He thought about the specific way she smelled when he carried her to bed after she'd fallen asleep on the couch. Boom, soap, and something sweet he'd never been able to identify precisely. Just Lily. Just the scent of his kid. He sat on the floor of the Whitmore Grand's 14th floor ballroom and held that thought carefully and let it do what it always did. It brought him back. The paramedics wanted him on a gurney. Ethan declined twice, politely, and the third time he declined less politely, which was when the younger of the 2 paramedics, barely 25, earnest in the way that people are earnest before the job has had enough time to sand the edges off, gave up and settled for cleaning the cut above his ear while Ethan sat on an overturned crate in the hotel's service corridor and answered the same questions he'd already answered twice. The detective's name was Carla Reyes. She was maybe 45, built like someone who'd played college sports and kept most of it, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the specific patience of a person who had learned that patience was more efficient than urgency in the long run. She had a small notebook that she wrote in with a mechanical pencil, which Ethan noticed because nobody used mechanical pencils anymore, and she asked her questions in the calm, unhurried way of someone who already knew more than she was letting on and was checking her knowledge against his account. "Walk me through the north corridor again," she said, "from the moment you entered it." Ethan walked her through it again. He kept it accurate, and he kept it linear, which was harder than it sounded when the adrenaline was still clearing from his system and the paramedic was doing something moderately uncomfortable near his hairline. He left out the 2 seconds he'd spent thinking about Lily, because that wasn't information Detective Reyes needed, and it was his. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she wrote something down and then looked up at him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very direct. You said you recognized the coordination as a professional operation, the positioning, the throat mics, the signal jamming. She paused. How? I've seen it before. Where? He'd known this question was coming. It had been coming since the moment the first officer had assessed the scene and understood that the man sitting on the ballroom floor in the torn dress shirt was not simply a lucky civilian. I was a Navy SEAL for 11 years. I left 4 years ago. Reyes wrote that down. She did it without the raised eyebrow or the impressed pause that civilians usually produced at that sentence, which told him she'd already known or strongly suspected. What's your current occupation? I teach history at Caldwell Middle School. She looked up from the notebook. This time the expression was almost something. History. 8th grade mostly, some 7th. She held the look for a moment, then returned to the notebook. Mr. Walker, the operation we're looking at, based on what we found in the last 2 hours, was planned over a period of several months. Blueprints of this floor were recovered from a vehicle in the hotel parking garage, along with forged credentials for 7 individuals. The jamming equipment had been installed in the communications room 48 hours before the event by someone posing as a hotel maintenance contractor. She paused to let that settle. This was not improvised. These were not amateurs. No, Ethan agreed. They weren't. Which makes what happened in that ballroom tonight. She stopped, chose different words. Which raises significant questions about how a middle school history teacher managed to dismantle most of it in under 10 minutes. 8, Ethan said. She looked at him. It was closer to 8 minutes, from when the lights went out. Reyes studied him for a long moment. Then she wrote something down, and what she wrote seemed longer than what he'd said, and he found himself vaguely curious about what it was. The man you encountered in the north corridor, the one you left in the linen storage room. He's in custody. He has professional military tattoos consistent with Eastern European Special Operations units. The man you engaged near the main entrance has identification indicating he's a licensed private security contractor who has worked in active conflict zones in the last 6 years. She tapped her pencil against the notebook cover. 3 of the 8 individuals we've identified tonight have similar backgrounds. So I want to ask you again, more specifically, how did you assess the threat, isolate the signal jamming equipment, and neutralize 2 trained operatives while sustaining what appear to be non-critical injuries? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Not because he was hiding anything, he wasn't, but because the honest answer was complicated in ways that had nothing to do with tonight. In that kind of work, he said finally, you don't forget how. That's the problem and the point at the same time. I walked into that room tonight and my brain started doing what it was trained to do before I made a conscious decision about it. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were scraped. He hadn't noticed that during. I'm a history teacher. That's not a cover. That's what I am now. But what I was, that doesn't go away. It just goes quiet. Tonight it needed to be loud again. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Your wife, she said, and the shift was gentle enough that it didn't feel like an intrusion. Exactly. Sarah Walker, deceased 4 years ago. He'd known that was in the background check she'd already run. He still felt it land the way it always landed. Not sharply, not anymore, but with the specific, settled weight of something permanent. Car accident. She was coming home from her sister's house. I'm sorry. Yeah. She gave it 2 seconds. You resigned your commission 3 months after her death. She died on a Tuesday. I was deployed. I didn't make it back in time. He said it the same way he always said it, factually, without elaboration, because elaboration opened rooms he'd furnished carefully and didn't care to let strangers walk through. My daughter was 6 years old. She needed her father home, so I came home. Reyes wrote something, stopped writing. That's a significant sacrifice. It wasn't a sacrifice, Ethan said. It was a choice. Sacrifice implies you did it for someone else. I needed to come home as much as Lily needed me there. He paused. Maybe more. The paramedic finished with his ear and began wrapping his left hand, which apparently had sustained damage he hadn't specifically noted during the events that caused it. Ethan watched this process with the mild detachment of someone consulting a damage report on a vehicle he'd driven hard and would need to assess properly later. The operation's primary target was Miss Sinclair, Reyes said, returning to the notebook. We're working backward from the personnel and the equipment to establish who commissioned it. but that's going to take time. What I can tell you is that the level of planning and the quality of the personnel suggests this was funded at a significant level. Someone wanted her very badly, and they were willing to spend real money on it. Any idea why? Sinclair Capital has significant interests in several industries where the wrong kind of leverage over a CEO would be worth considerable sums. That's the working theory. She closed the notebook. We'll have more as the investigation develops. For now, I need you to stay available. You'll likely need to come in for a formal statement in the next 48 hours, and depending on how the prosecutions develop, you may be called as a witness. Understood. She stood, paused. Mr. Walker. He looked up. What you did tonight? She stopped again, and he could see her deciding between the professional version of what she wanted to say and the human version. She went with something in between. There were 341 people in that ballroom. Based on what we know about the operation's contingency protocols, the documents we recovered indicate that if the primary extraction met significant resistance, the secondary order was to use the crowd as leverage. She let that sit for a moment. What you did tonight made that secondary order unnecessary. She left without waiting for a response, which Ethan appreciated. He sat in the service corridor while the paramedic finished with his hand and thought about what she'd just told him. Secondary order, leverage. He'd known it was possible. It was always possible, in an operation where the primary objective hit friction. But knowing it abstractly and hearing it confirmed were different things, and the difference lodged somewhere in his chest and stayed there. 341 people. He thought about the retired federal judge who'd wanted to tell him about the donation, about the young woman Vanessa had been holding when the police came through the doors, about the hospital administrators with their pleased, disbelieving faces, about the venture capitalists comparing watches at the bar, who were almost certainly not comparing watches anymore. He thought about how close it had been. The specific, unglamorous arithmetic of it, one missed grab in the north corridor, 1 second longer on the floor after that forearm to the side of his head, 1 less second of intermittent jamming before Parrish got the emergency line working. Any one of those, and the calculus of tonight changed completely. It hadn't been smooth. It hadn't been the version of events that would make sense as a movie, where every move flows into the next and the outcome feels inevitable. It had been ugly and improvised, and he'd taken hits he was going to feel for the next 2 weeks. And somewhere in this hotel, there was at least one operative who'd gotten out through the service exits before law enforcement had fully closed the perimeter, which meant the investigation ahead was going to be complicated. But 341 people had walked out of the Whitmore Grand. That was the number that mattered. He found Hargrove 40 minutes later in a first aid station the paramedics had set up in the hotel lobby. The older man was sitting in a folding chair with an ice pack against his jaw, and the expression of someone who was not entirely pleased with how his evening had concluded, but had made a certain peace with the necessity of it. His tuxedo jacket was draped over the chair behind him. His shirt had been white at the start of the evening. "How's the jaw?" Ethan said. "Attached." Hargrove shifted the ice pack slightly. "The gentleman near the east corridor had a left hook that I did not adequately account for." He assessed Ethan's bandaged hand and the fresh tape above his ear. "You look worse than I do." "I had a harder assignment." Hargrove looked toward the hotel entrance, where police vehicles were still visible through the glass doors, lights cutting through the dark in red and blue. "The detective spoke to me for about 20 minutes. Reyes. She's thorough." "She is." He paused. "She'll put it together, eventually. Who planned it? Who paid for it? These things unravel, given time." He shifted the ice pack again. "I'm more concerned about Ms. Sinclair. Someone commissioned a significant operation against her. Even with tonight's outcome, that motivation doesn't simply disappear." Ethan hadn't stopped thinking about that either. She'll need to restructure her security. Comprehensively, if they replace personnel on her protection detail, someone had access to information about that detail's configuration. That's an internal problem. Or an external one. Either way, it's not solved tonight. No. They sat with that for a moment. The lobby was quieter than it had been an hour ago. Most of the guests had been processed and cleared, transported to the hospital for evaluation, or released to go home. The chandeliers overhead were still lit, blazing and indifferent to the wreckage of the evening. The crystal catching light the same way it had when the room had been full of champagne and applause, and the ordinary, beautiful obliviousness of people who had no idea what was happening on the floor above them. Your SEAL background, Hargrove said. Not a question. She knows. Reyes, yes. I meant, how long before it's in the news? Ethan thought about that. It would happen. It always happened. Information moved the way water moved, finding the lowest point of containment and flowing through it. A story like tonight's was going to generate coverage, and coverage was going to generate questions, and questions were eventually going to produce the answer that a middle school history teacher with a Navy SEAL background had been the reason the evening hadn't ended catastrophically. Couple of days, maybe less. Hargrove nodded. Will that be a problem? For you? The school? I don't know. He said it honestly. He hadn't gotten that far yet. Right now, I'm still working on tonight. Fair enough. He found Vanessa in a conference room on the hotel's third floor that had been requisitioned as a secondary interview space. She was sitting at the end of a long table with a cup of coffee that was almost certainly cold, two police officers finishing a conversation with her, and the particular quality of stillness that came after a very long period of sustained alertness, like a machine that's been running at high capacity gradually returning to idle. Her emerald dress was undamaged, which struck him as almost surreal given the state of everything else. The officers finished and left. She looked up when Ethan came through the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had been through something together that hadn't been processed yet and didn't need to be processed right now. Sit down, she said. You look like you should sit down. I'm fine. You keep saying that. She pushed the chair across from her out with one foot. Sit down anyway. He sat down. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands, the same way he'd turned his water glass in the ballroom hours ago, a lifetime ago, and he wondered if she knew she was doing it. They told me about the secondary order, she said, what the plan was if the extraction hit resistance. Reyes told you. Yes. She looked at the table for a moment. I've been sitting here trying to figure out how I feel about that information, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I don't entirely know. She paused. I know I'm supposed to feel something specific and appropriate. Gratitude, relief, whichever. And I do feel those things. I just also feel, I don't know, like the floor is somewhere different than it was this morning. That's accurate, Ethan said. That feeling, it's accurate. She looked at him. Does it go away? He considered lying because the kind lie was available and she was clearly exhausted and the honest answer was not simple. He decided she deserved the honest answer. It changes. The floor settles somewhere new, and after a while that new place starts to feel like the floor again. He thought about the months after Sarah, the specific vertigo of a world that had been reorganized around an absence. It takes longer than you think it should. She nodded slowly. You lost your wife 4 years ago. I know. Reyes mentioned, I asked her about you. I hope that's all right. She didn't sound like someone who was particularly sorry for asking, which he respected. She said you left the SEALs to raise your daughter. Lily, she's 10. Something moved across Vanessa's face. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. What's she like? It was such an ordinary question. The most ordinary question in the most extraordinary evening, and it hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. She's loud, he said, and the word came with something that was almost a laugh, the involuntary kind. She has opinions about everything, ecosystems mostly, this week. She chose the deep ocean for a school project, and now I have to figure out how to make an anglerfish before Monday morning. Vanessa stared at him. That's what you were thinking about in the ballroom before Craft supplies, mostly. The googly eyes situation. She put her hand over her mouth. It was not quite a laugh either, but it was real, and it moved through the room and changed the quality of the air in a way that was hard to describe precisely, but was unmistakable. Something unwound slightly in both of them. Googly eyes? She said. The drawer might be empty. I genuinely don't know. She shook her head slowly. You were sitting there, in a room that had already become... She gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the 14th floor, toward all of it. And you were thinking about craft supplies. I wasn't sure it had become anything yet, he said. I was still hoping I was wrong. Were you? No, I was never wrong about rooms like that. He looked at his bandaged hand. I was just hoping. The silence came back, softer this time. Outside the conference room door, he could hear the hotel beginning its slow process of returning to something. Not normal, because normal was a long way off, but the procedural motions of an institution reasserting itself. Voices in the corridor, footsteps, someone moving equipment. You didn't have to do what you did tonight, Vanessa said. I want you to know I understand that. You were a guest. You were... She stopped. You could have stayed at that table. No, Ethan said simply. I couldn't. She looked at him with an expression that was trying to read him and finding more than she'd expected. Why not? And I'm not asking for the hero answer. I'm asking for the real one. He thought about it. The real one was always harder to locate than the easy answer, which was something about duty or training or sin instinct. Those weren't wrong exactly, but they were incomplete. Because I could see it, he said finally. And if you can see something and you don't do anything about it, that's a choice too. That's not neutrality, it's just a different kind of decision. He paused. And I've made that choice before. In situations where I told myself there wasn't enough information, or the risk was too high, or it wasn't my call. And I was right to make it sometimes, tactically. But there are moments it still sits with me. The other choice. What might have happened? He looked at the cold coffee in her hands. Tonight wasn't that close, wasn't it? The decision, not the situation. He clarified. The decision wasn't close. The situation was, he tilted his head slightly, closer than I'd have preferred. She was quiet for a moment. Your daughter, is she? She's with a babysitter. She thinks I'm at a work dinner. He paused. I need to call her before it gets later. Of course. Vanessa straightened slightly. Of course, go. She hesitated. Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his name, and they both noticed it. The things you said, about seeing something and not looking away. I want you to know that's not something I'm going to forget. He nodded. He didn't have a polished answer for it. He stood, and the chair scraped back on the floor, and the sound was ordinary and grounding. At the conference room door he stopped, because there was something he'd been holding that she should probably know. He turned back. The operative who got out through the service exit. I didn't stop him. He's still... Reyes knows, Vanessa said. They have a description. They'll find him. Probably. He wasn't as confident as she sounded, but that was her call to carry or not carry. Make sure your people do a full internal audit before they rebuild your security detail. Whoever got to your team's configuration, that's not an outside job. That's someone with access. Her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened immediately. I know you know, He stopped. Old habit. Saying the thing out loud anyway. Yeah. She held his gaze for a moment. Good habit, she said. He nodded once and walked out into the corridor. His phone had 2 bars of service now. Parrish's emergency call had brought the cavalry, and whatever intermittent damage he'd done to the jamming equipment had apparently finished resolving itself. He had 14 missed calls. 6 from the babysitter, which made his stomach drop before he read the timestamps and realized they'd started coming in during the news coverage, not because of Lily. 4 from his sister in Denver, 2 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out, when he listened to the voicemail, to be a reporter who had somehow already gotten his cell number, which was impressive and alarming in equal measure. 2 from a number he did recognize. His daughter's school-issued tablet, which she was technically not supposed to use after 8:30, but which she used after 8:30 reliably when she thought something important warranted it. He listened to the second voicemail. Her voice was not panicked. Lily didn't panic. She'd inherited the specific Walker quality of going very quiet and deliberate under pressure, which was either genetic or learned, and he'd never been able to determine which. She sounded like herself. But underneath the 10-year-old practicality of her voice, there was something else, the thing that only he could hear because he'd been listening to her for a decade. Dad, there's stuff on the news about the hotel where your dinner was. Mrs. Patterson says it's probably fine and you're probably just busy. I'm not worried, but call me when you get this, okay? Call me. He stood in the third-floor corridor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel and listened to his daughter's voice ask him to call her and felt something move through his chest that had nothing to do with bruised ribs. He called her. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been holding the tablet. Dad? Hey, Bug. I'm okay. A pause. He could hear her exhale, not a child's exhale, not dramatic, just the specific release of held breath. Okay, she said. Okay, Mrs. Patterson owes me $3. Did you bet her? I said you were fine. She said we should wait to hear. I said I'd give her $3 if you weren't fine, and she'd give me $3 if you were. Lily. She agreed to the terms, Dad. It was a fair market. He laughed. It came out rougher than usual. His throat, apparently, had been through things he'd also not specifically inventoried. But it was real, and it was the best sound he'd heard since the emergency lights came on. Go to sleep, he said. I'll be home in a couple hours. Are you actually okay? Your voice sounds, I'm okay. I got bumped around a little. A silence. In that silence, he could feel her deciding how much to say and how much to hold. She'd been doing that since she was 7. The oldest child of a single-parent thing, the awareness that some information needed managing. He hated it and loved it and felt guilty about both reactions simultaneously. Okay, she said again. Come home. I'm coming home. And Dad? She paused. We need googly eyes. For the anglerfish. I checked the drawer. He closed his eyes. I'll stop somewhere on the way. Everything else is ready. I did the clay part. It looks... Another pause, the honest kind. It looks more like a potato right now, but I think the googly eyes will fix it. Googly eyes fix most things, he said. He could hear her smile through the phone. It was the specific sound of her face doing it. He'd had 10 years of listening to his daughter's face through phones and across rooms and in the dark when he sat outside her door after nightmares. He knew every version of it. Get some sleep, he said. I love you. Love you too. Come home. He hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, with the phone in his bandaged hand and the noise of the investigation and the processing of the evening continuing all around him. Officers and paramedics and hotel staff and the slow, necessary machinery of law enforcement working through the wreckage of a night that had gone very wrong, and then, improbably, not. A door opened somewhere down the corridor and he heard Detective Reyes's voice, efficient and deliberate, asking for a specific report. Somewhere above him, the 14th floor was being processed in the careful, methodical way that people who did this work processed scenes like this, cataloging and photographing and bagging and labeling, building the evidentiary picture of a plan that had been months in the making and 8 minutes in the unraveling. He thought about what Hargrove had said. These things unravel, given time. He thought about Vanessa in the conference room, turning her cold coffee cup in her hands, asking whether the displaced feeling went away. He thought about a communications tech named Parrish who had picked up a red handset on a wall and done exactly what a frightened person needed to do in the worst moment of his working life. He thought about Robert Hargrove taking a left hook from a man 30 years younger and refusing to go down because going down was not the option he'd selected. None of them were heroes, exactly. That wasn't the right word for it. Heroes were clean and decisive and arrived with the right resources at the right moment and knew what they were doing and why. What he'd seen tonight, what he'd been part of tonight, was messier and more human and more frightening than that, and more real. It was people in a bad situation making the choice to not look away. That was all. That was everything. Ethan Walker put his phone in his pocket, nodded to a passing officer who gave him a look that was somewhere between respect and curiosity, and went to find his jacket so he could go home. The anglerfish looked exactly like a potato with teeth. Lily had done her best. The clay was shaped with genuine effort, and the mouth was admirably wide, and the body had a reasonable approximation of fins along its sides. But the overall effect was something between unsettling and endearing, which was actually, Ethan thought, not far from an accurate description of an anglerfish. He'd stopped at a 24-hour pharmacy on the way home and found the last package of googly eyes on a shelf between pipe cleaners and glitter glue. And when he'd walked through the door at 2 in the morning and held them up, Lily had appeared from the hallway in her pajamas with the specific expression of someone who had absolutely not been sleeping. "You were supposed to be asleep," he said. "I was resting," she said, "with my eyes open." He looked at her. She looked at him. At the bandaged hand, the tape above his ear, the fact that his formal shirt was missing 2 buttons and had a rust-colored stain near the collar that she was old enough to identify. Something moved through her face that was not a child's face at all, that was instead the face of someone carrying more awareness than a 10-year-old should have to carry, and it sat in his chest like a stone. "I'm okay," he said. The same thing he'd been saying all night to various people. He meant it more with her. She crossed the room and hugged him, not the exuberant, full-body hug of a small child, but the quieter, more deliberate kind. Her arms around his midsection, her face against his chest, holding on with the specific intention of someone making sure something is real. He hugged her back carefully because his ribs had filed their complaint and it was still pending, and he stood in his own hallway at 2 a.m, smelling her hair and being home. "The potato needs googly eyes," she said finally, into his shirt. "I know. Can we do it now?" "Tomorrow," he said. "It'll still be a potato tomorrow." She pulled back and looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to push. Then she decided not to. "Okay." She looked at the googly eyes in his bandaged hand. "Those are the right size. Good choice. I have my moments." "Yeah." She looked at him once more, the full assessment, the 10-year-old version of Reyes's direct gaze, and apparently satisfied herself with what she found. "Okay. Bed." "Bed," he agreed. He checked on her twice before he slept. Old habit that had started when she was an infant and that he'd never been able to break regardless of how rational he was about it in the daylight hours. The first time she was reading, which she denied. The second time she was actually asleep, her book on her chest the way it always landed, and he stood in the doorway of her room for longer than was strictly necessary and listened to her breathe. He slept 4 hours and woke up to 6 news alerts on his phone. The story had found him faster than he'd hoped and slower than Hargrove had predicted. By 7 a.m, it was on 3 local channels and 2 national ones, and by 9, it had migrated to the kind of platform reach that meant his sister in Denver was calling again, and his department head at Caldwell Middle School had left a message asking if he needed anything, and also, gently, whether they might need to discuss the situation. The phrasing of that second question told him that the school was already fielding calls, which meant the story had specifics in it: his name, his background, his current occupation. Someone had made the connection and published it, and now it was out. He sat at his kitchen table with coffee and read the coverage and felt the complicated, uncomfortable thing he always felt when attention arrived that he hadn't asked for. It wasn't false modesty, exactly. He knew what he'd done, and he knew it mattered. It was something else. The way that being seen in a particular moment by a very large number of people who weren't there compressed everything that had actually happened into a shape that was cleaner and more certain than the truth. The coverage made it sound inevitable, heroic in the movie sense of the word, where the outcome is never in doubt, and the person doing the thing is operating from a place of confidence rather than a place of controlled terror and improvisation, and the occasional moment of genuine uncertainty about whether he was going to stay on his feet. He didn't call anyone back that morning. He made Lily breakfast and they sat across from each other, and she told him about the ecosystem unit and the specific indignity of being assigned a partner for the oral component who kept calling deep-sea vents underwater volcanoes, which was not, she explained at some length, technically wrong, but was certainly imprecise. And he listened to all of it and felt the particular uncomplicated gratitude of a Saturday morning that was just a Saturday morning. After breakfast, they fixed the anglerfish. Lily held it up when they were done and examined it from multiple angles. The googly eyes were, objectively, an improvement. "It looks surprised," she decided. "It's been through a lot," Ethan said. "Anglerfish live in complete darkness," she said, the way she said things she'd read and retained with the quiet authority of someone who had checked the source. "They can't see much anyway. The light thing on their head is how they hunt." She turned the clay figure over in her hands. "It's kind of sad, swimming around in the dark all the time." "Maybe they don't think of it that way," Ethan said. "Maybe the dark is just the place they know how to navigate." She looked at him in the particular way she had that meant she suspected he was talking about two things at once but wasn't certain enough to call it. Maybe, she said, and set the anglerfish down on the table next to the googly eye packaging. And that was that. The call from Vanessa came 4 days later. He was between classes. 5th period had just ended. 7th period didn't start for 22 minutes, which meant he was eating a sandwich at his desk and grading a set of quizzes on the Byzantine collapse of 1453 with the specific resigned patience of a teacher who has explained what Constantinople means for the 4th time this semester. His phone showed a number he didn't have saved, but he recognized the area code and answered it. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up," she said. "I'm between classes," he said. "I've got about 20 minutes. I'll be efficient." A pause that wasn't uncomfortable. "How's the hand?" "Functional. The ear's fine. The ribs are negotiating." He put the sandwich down. "How are you?" "Working," she said. "Which is, I don't know if that's healthy or avoidance, but it's what I'm doing." Another pause. "We identified the person inside my security structure who gave access to the details configuration." He hadn't asked because it wasn't his business, but he'd thought about it. "Who?" "My deputy director of operations. He'd been with the firm for 6 years. Someone got to him through his finances. He was in debt, significant debt, and they offered a solution." Her voice was even, but he could hear what was under it. 6 years, that was the part that would stay with her. Not the stranger with the throat mic in the North Corridor, but the person who had eaten lunch in her building and attended her strategy meetings and known her travel schedule and sold it. "He's cooperating with the investigation. Reyes says it helps the prosecution's case." "Does that help you?" A beat. "No," she said. "Not really. Not yet." She paused. "The people behind the operation, we know more now. There's a private equity group with interests that directly conflict with the merger we're pursuing. The kidnapping was leverage. They wanted to use me to force the merger off the table." She said it flatly, the way you say things you've had a few days to process and have moved from shock to something more workable. It's almost mundane when you lay it out. Someone wanted something and was willing to do monstrous things to get it. "Most monstrous things are mundane at the root," Ethan said. "That's not comforting?" "It wasn't meant to be." She laughed, brief and real. "Okay, fair." He heard her move, the sound of her office chair or something shifting. "I'm calling because I want to tell you something in person, and I wanted to ask first whether that was all right. Whether I could come to you or wherever you're comfortable. I have something I want to discuss, and I didn't want to do it through a lawyer or an assistant." "You're not going to try to give me money," he said. A pause. "Would that be a problem?" "Yes." "Okay." She didn't argue it, which he appreciated. "It's not that. Or not only that. There are legal things the firm's counsel wants to address with you, liability documentation, witness preparation for the prosecution, that kind of thing. But that's not the call I'm making right now." She paused. "What I want to talk about is something I've been building. An idea that started in that hotel conference room and has been taking shape for the last 4 days. I want your input on it, specifically." He looked at the stack of ungraded quizzes, at the half-eaten sandwich, at the classroom beyond his door where 36 8th graders were going to arrive in approximately 17 minutes, wanting to talk about the fall of Constantinople and, more pressingly, about the fact that their teacher had apparently dismantled a professional kidnapping operation with his bare hands last Saturday, a subject he had been declining to engage with all week to the audible frustration of several students. "All right," he said, "come to the school. Friday, after 3. She arrived at 3:15, which he suspected meant she had arrived at 3, and spent 15 minutes deciding whether walking into a middle school to discuss her nascent foundation plans with a history teacher was the correct approach to the situation. She was in a coat rather than formal wear, no visible security detail that he could identify immediately, and she looked different from the woman in the emerald dress. Not less composed, but differently composed. More like a person and less like a performance of one. The dark circles under her eyes were visible, and she hadn't tried particularly hard to conceal them. He met her in the main corridor and walked her back to his classroom, which he realized, seeing it through her eyes, was a fairly significant change of context from the Whitmore Grand. The walls were covered in student-made timelines of world history, many of which contained errors he'd been planning to address. The desks were arranged in clusters. There was a model of Constantinople's defensive walls in one corner that a student had built for extra credit and that had been sitting there for 2 months because he didn't know what to do with it. She looked around the room with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "This is where you work. Every day," he said. "You can move that stack off the chair." She moved the stack, quizzes, he noted, still the Byzantine unit, and sat down in the chair across from his desk, and for a moment the geometry of it was slightly absurd. A CEO sitting in a middle school classroom while a former SEAL graded papers, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Tell me about the foundation," he said. She did. The idea had come from the conversation in the conference room, she explained, from what he'd said about Lily, about coming home, about the specific reconfiguration of a life around the space left by someone who was gone. She'd done the research over 4 sleepless days, driven partly by the kind of restless energy that follows a crisis and needs somewhere to go, and partly by something more sustained than that. There were thousands of children in the city alone who had lost a parent. Resources existed, in theory, counseling programs, school-based support, the scattered infrastructure of grief services, but they were fragmented, underfunded, and largely reactive rather than proactive. A family arrived in crisis and found a patchwork system that required them to navigate complexity at the moment when they had the least capacity to navigate anything. What she was proposing was a foundation that would change that. Funded from her own capital and structured to attract additional backing, it would operate as a coordination layer, connecting existing services, identifying gaps, funding the specific things that fell between existing programs, tutoring for kids whose grades had slipped after a loss, childcare subsidies for single parents working to keep the household stable, access to grief counselors in schools that didn't have them, not heroic, not headline generating, the unglamorous practical work of making sure that a family in the worst year of their life could find what they needed without spending 6 months fighting bureaucratic tangles. She called it the Meridian Home Foundation. She had, she said, a board in development and a director candidate she was vetting, and a legal structure that was 48 hours from being formalized. What she didn't have was an advisory council, and specifically what she was missing was someone who understood what the families she wanted to serve actually needed. Not theoretically, from the inside. "You," she said, "I want you on the advisory council, not in a figurehead role. I don't need your name on a letterhead. I need your perspective in the room when we make decisions. What it actually looks like. When a kid loses a parent, and the parent who's left has to figure out how to hold it together. What's missing? What would have helped?" She paused. What did help? He sat with that for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the classroom windows at the low angle it took in late fall, catching the dust on the surface of the Constantinople model and the edges of the student timelines on the walls. He thought about the first year after Sarah, the specific ways that the world had either shown up or not shown up for him and Lily. The school counselor who'd checked in every week for 3 months and then every month for a year after that, and how much that had mattered in a way that was hard to quantify. The neighbor who'd left food on the porch twice a week without asking whether they needed it. The grief group he'd attended 4 times before deciding it wasn't right for him, but the 4 times had mattered anyway. The teacher who'd quietly moved Lily to a different reading group so she'd have a friend in it when her original group's dynamics had become hard for her. Small things. Specific things. The kind of things that didn't appear in policy documents or program descriptions, but that made the actual difference in whether a family stayed above water or went under. "I'm not a nonprofit professional," he said. "I know. I have a full-time job. The council meets monthly, maybe quarterly once the structure is established." He looked at her. She was watching him with the same quality of attention she'd brought to that hotel ballroom. Not the performance of listening, but the real thing. He thought about what she'd said to him in the conference room, the thing about seeing something and not looking away. He thought about the fact that she'd taken that conversation and done something with it, rather than filing it in the category of things that happen in extremity and don't transfer to ordinary life. "You should know," he said, "that I'm going to be honest in those rooms. If I think the program design is missing something, I'm going to say so." "I'm counting on it," she said. I don't need people to agree with me. I need people to tell me when I'm wrong before I build something expensive around a mistake. And if I think you should scrap something entirely and start over, then you tell me that and we talk about it." She paused. I've been running a company since I was 27. I know how to take critical input. I'm not always graceful about it, but I can do it. He believed her. Okay, he said. Something crossed her face. Not relief exactly, because she didn't look like someone who'd been genuinely uncertain about the outcome. More like the expression of someone who had confirmed a calculation they were already fairly confident in. There's one more thing, she said. The announcement. I'm doing a public launch in 3 weeks. Press, community partners, the formal board introduction. I'd like you to be there, not on the stage. She said it before he could respond. I know you won't stand on a stage, but in the room. So that when people ask me what made this foundation feel necessary, I can look at the right person when I explain. He thought about it. Lily has a soccer game that Saturday. I'll schedule around it. What time? He almost laughed. 10 in the morning. Afternoon launch, she said simply, and took out her phone to note it. He walked her back to the main entrance, past the student artwork in the corridor, and the bulletin boards with their college planning guides, and the trophy case from the school's one genuinely impressive athletic year in 1987. At the entrance, she stopped and looked back at the corridor. You're good at this, she said. Teaching? Being here. She meant it as more than geography, he understood. Being present in an ordinary place. I used to think that people who stepped back from big careers were running away from something. I used to think that was the only explanation that made sense. She looked at him. I don't think that anymore. Some of them are running, he said honestly. I was, a little, at first, after Sarah. I ran toward Lily, and the running wasn't the worst motivation, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He thought about the North Corridor, the 4 seconds in the dark, the choice he'd made that had nothing to do with running. But you can run toward something until it becomes where you actually live, and then it's not running anymore. It's just home. She nodded slowly, taking that in. Then she buttoned her coat against the November air coming through the entrance doors and looked at him with an expression that was direct and genuine and had none of the composed performance of the woman at the podium who had stood under the chandeliers and given the applause what it expected. Thank you, she said. Not for the foundation thing, for the other thing. The thing you did in a room full of people who didn't know they needed it. Parrish made the call, Ethan said. Hargrove held a position he had no business holding at his age. You kept 300 people from panicking for 30 minutes through sheer will. He shrugged carefully on account of the ribs. I bumped into some people in a dark corridor. You are remarkably bad at accepting gratitude, she said. I've been told that. By your daughter? Frequently. She shook her head, but the expression on her face was the real one. The one without performance in it. The one that had been sitting underneath the composure all along, in the ballroom, in the conference room, and now here, in the entrance corridor of Caldwell Middle School on a Friday afternoon in November. She said goodbye and walked to the car waiting at the curb, and he stood at the entrance and watched it pull away. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the Meridian Home Foundation held its public launch at a community center in the eastern part of the city, not a hotel ballroom, not a venue with chandeliers, a community center with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting, and a modest podium that Vanessa had specifically requested be placed at floor level rather than on a stage. There were local officials, community partner organizations, a handful of press, and a room full of people whose connection to the foundation's mission was personal rather than institutional. Parents who'd done the math alone, kids who knew what a bad year looked like from the inside. Robert Hargrove was in the front row. His jaw had healed, and he'd returned to the foundation board and was, according to the brief conversation Ethan had with him before the event started, already driving the director candidate slightly insane with the specificity of his governance questions, which he seemed to regard as a compliment to himself. You look better than the last time I saw you, Hargrove said, assessing Ethan's uninjured, normally dressed person. Lower bar to clear, Ethan said. The left hook, Hargrove said, with the reflective air of someone revisiting a professional assessment. I should have seen it. The shoulder dropped. It always drops. At least you stayed up. Barely. He said it without embarrassment, which Ethan respected. My trainer says I have the reflexes of a fit 60-year-old. How old are you? 63. He paused. He means it as a compliment. Ethan looked around the room. He found the thing that had happened to him before in places that mattered, the specific quieting of everything non-essential until only what was actually present remained. The folding chairs filling with people. The sound of a community center in active use. A woman near the entrance who was reading the Foundation's one-page summary with the careful attention of someone looking for the line that would tell her whether this was real or just another program that would close in a year for lack of funding. A kid, maybe 11, sitting next to who was probably his surviving parent, looking at the ceiling with the particular expression of someone who had been brought to something important and was reserving judgment. Ethan thought about the anglerfish, swimming in the dark with a light on its head that it didn't choose and couldn't turn off, navigating an ocean that most creatures never saw. He thought about how Lily had said it was sad, and he'd said maybe the dark was just the place it knew how to move through. And he thought about whether he'd believed that when he said it, or whether he'd been saying it for her. He believed it now, he thought, or he was getting there. Vanessa began speaking. No notes. He'd noticed that about her, that she spoke without notes in the situations that mattered to her, when the words were coming from somewhere that didn't need a script. She talked about the Foundation's mission in concrete, specific terms that didn't reach for sentiment but found it anyway through precision. She talked about the gap between what families in crisis needed and what was currently available to them. She talked about the people who had made the Foundation possible, naming the board members, the director, the community partners, and then naming Hargrove, who acknowledged this with a nod that was less modest than he probably intended. She did not name Ethan. He had asked her not to. But when she talked about what had made this feel urgent, what had moved it from idea to intention in the space of a week, she turned slightly. Not toward him, not pointing, just the angle of her body shifting by a few degrees in the direction of where he was standing, and said, "Sometimes you end up in a room with someone whose clarity about what actually matters in a life reminds you of what you thought you knew but had been letting get complicated. And it changes the calculation." He stood against the back wall with his hands in his pockets and his ribs mostly healed and his daughter's science project already submitted and her anglerfish already graded, a B+, with the note that the bioluminescent lure was biologically accurate even if the overall proportions were approximate, which Lily had received with the solemn satisfaction of someone whose core thesis had been validated. And he listened to Vanessa Sinclair describe the work ahead in a room full of people who needed it to exist. Later, after the event, he found the kid who'd been looking at the ceiling. He was standing near the refreshment table with a cup of punch he wasn't drinking, and up close Ethan could see he was closer to 12. The age when the gap between what you feel and what you know how to say about it is at its widest, when everything is close to the surface and nothing has words yet. Ethan stood near him and didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there. The kid glanced over, then looked away, then looked back. "Are you someone?" he said. "Like, did you do something? My mom said there was a guy here who did something." "I'm a history teacher," Ethan said. The kid looked at him with the expression of someone receiving information that doesn't fully compute. "Okay," he said. "That's kind of boring." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "I know." "Is it good, though?" the kid asked. And then immediately, before Ethan could answer, he looked at his punch like he was embarrassed by the question. "I mean, like, do you like it?" Ethan thought about the 8th graders who kept calling Constantinople by the wrong name, and the quizzes he still needed to finish grading, and the way a room full of 12-year-olds went quiet sometimes when a story caught them, really caught them, the way stories do when they stop being about the past and start being about something immediate and recognizable. He thought about Friday afternoons and the ride home and Lily's voice on the phone asking him to come home, and the fact that he always did. "Yeah," he said, "I really like it." The kid nodded, still looking at his punch. Something in his shoulders shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but the way a held thing shifts when a small amount of pressure comes off it. He drank his punch. Ethan stood next to him in the community center while the room moved and talked around them, the ordinary motion of people trying to build something that would last longer than a single evening. Outside, November was doing what November did, gray and cold and smelling of coming weather. Ethan walked to his car in the community center parking lot, which was nothing like the Whitmore Grand's parking structure, which was nothing like the places he'd parked in before Lily, before home, before the version of himself that taught 8th graders, and showed up to school soccer games and stood in the back of community center events and watched people try to do something useful with the hard parts of their lives. He got in the car. He sat for a moment. Then he drove home because Lily had a soccer game Saturday, and they were out of milk and the week's quizzes weren't going to grade themselves, and because home was where the weight of things settled into something you could carry, and because the greatest victories he had come to understand in the particular unshowy way that genuine understanding arrives, not in bright moments of clarity, but slowly, like light coming under a door, were the ones that never made the news. They were the Tuesday mornings, and the argued homework, and the bedtime negotiations, and the Saturday games, and the conversations in cars about things that mattered, and the standing in doorways listening to someone breathe victories, the showing up victories, the staying victories, the coming home,